June 6, 1944, early afternoon. The Allied lodgment at Omaha Beach existed, but it did not function. The first American Sherman tanks had reached the shingle and moved inland as planned. Infantry followed according to doctrine. Within hours, both elements stopped moving. The reports arriving at command posts were consistent and incomprehensible. Tanks were intact but immobilized. Crews were alive but pinned. Infantry units were stalled in fields they had already crossed. German fire was present, but it did not explain the paralysis. The enemy was not counterattacking in strength. There was no coordinated German armor response. The advance had simply ceased. Forward observers began describing the same feature again and again. Earthen walls, chest-high. Thick hedgerows packed with roots, soil, and trees grown together over centuries. Every field was a compartment. Every exit was blocked. Roads were predictable. Openings were lethal. When Sherman tanks attempted to climb the hedgerows, their noses lifted, their bellies exposed, and their tracks lost purchase. At that moment, German infantry armed with Panzerfausts destroyed them at close range. This was not a failure of courage or firepower. It was a mechanical problem no one at higher headquarters had planned for. In the afternoon, along the edge of the beachhead, a reconnaissance soldier named Curtis Culin stood among the wreckage of German beach obstacles blown apart by naval gunfire. Steel girders, angled and jagged, lay half-buried in the sand. He had already seen what the bocage did to tanks. He had watched them die trying to climb. Culin made a decision without authority and without permission. He concluded that the hedgerows could not be climbed. They had to be cut. He took the steel from the German obstacles and proposed welding it directly onto the front of Sherman tanks, forming hardened prongs that would split the earth and roots instead of riding over them. The idea violated doctrine. It had no approval. It existed only because nothing else worked. There was no formal order, no directive from Corps or Army headquarters. Mechanics were asked, not instructed. Tanks were altered quietly. Steel was cut, welded, and reinforced in makeshift shops near the front. The decision was not recorded in a planning document. It was not debated in a conference room. It was executed because the alternative was continued paralysis. By the time senior commanders became aware of the modification, the first altered tanks were already testing themselves against the hedgerows. The decision had been made. The system would react later. The military opportunity in Normandy existed, but it was narrowly defined by physical reality rather than enemy strength. By the evening of June 6th, American forces possessed everything required for a rapid inland advance on paper. They had established a continuous beachhead. They had landed sufficient armor. Artillery was ashore and registering targets. Air superiority was uncontested. German formations opposite the American sector were under strength, fragmented, and recovering from the shock of the landings. What constrained the advance was not resistance, but geometry. The bocage countryside fractured the battlefield into thousands of enclosed compartments. Each field was bounded by an earthen wall packed with stone, reinforced by roots, and crowned with dense vegetation. These barriers were not hedges in the conventional sense. They were centuries-old agricultural fortifications, immune to small arms fire and resistant to artillery unless deliberately targeted. Visibility was reduced to tens of meters. Movement was forced into predictable gaps. Maneuver space did not exist. From a purely military perspective, the American advantage lay in combined arms momentum. Sherman tanks were designed to move, suppress, and protect infantry. Infantry was trained to advance under armored cover. Artillery and air power were structured to support forward movement, not static clearance. The German units in the sector lacked the mass to withstand a coordinated armored breakout. They were vulnerable to isolation, bypass, and collapse if pressure could be applied continuously. That opportunity was real and immediate. Time favored the attacker only if momentum was maintained. Every hour of delay allowed German commanders to reposition, reinforce choke points, and adapt their defenses to the terrain they already understood. In open country, the solution would have been straightforward. Tanks would advance, infantry would follow, resistance would be crushed by weight of fire. In Normandy's bocage, those assumptions failed. Tanks could not lead without exposing fatal weaknesses. Infantry could not advance without tanks. Artillery could not see what it was firing at. Air power could not distinguish targets beneath tree cover. Yet the Germans did not control the terrain in a conventional sense. They occupied it thinly. Their strength derived from the environment doing the work for them. A single squad with anti-tank weapons could hold an entire field because the field itself forced the attacker into vulnerability. This is what made the opportunity both constrained and decisive. If the terrain could be neutralized mechanically, the German defensive position would collapse rapidly. There were no deep belts of fortifications beyond the hedgerows. There were no prepared fallback lines capable of absorbing sustained armored thrusts. The American logistical system was already functioning. Fuel, ammunition, and replacements were flowing ashore in increasing volume. The operational payoff of solving the bocage problem was disproportionate to the effort required. Breaching hedgerows safely would restore the tank's intended role. Armor could advance without rearing upward. Guns could remain level. Infantry could move behind steel rather than ahead of it. German ambush tactics would lose their effectiveness immediately. This was not an abstract possibility. It was observable on the ground. Reconnaissance confirmed that once a tank penetrated a hedgerow intact, German resistance inside the next field often collapsed within minutes. The enemy lacked depth. They relied on repetition of the same terrain advantage again and again. The opportunity was therefore binary. Either the bocage remained an impassable barrier and the campaign devolved into slow attrition, or it was mechanically defeated and the American advance resumed its intended pace. There was no need for new divisions. No requirement for additional firepower. No strategic redeployment was necessary. The entire problem reduced to a single constraint imposed by terrain on armored movement. That constraint, once removed, promised immediate operational freedom. Roads could be seized. Crossroads could be bypassed. German units could be cut off rather than engaged head-on. The battlefield would expand from confined enclosures into maneuver space. The window for this opportunity was limited. Delay meant adaptation by the defender. Speed meant collapse. The military logic was unambiguous. Solve the terrain problem, and the campaign would move. Fail to solve it, and superiority in men and material would bleed away field by field. The opportunity existed not because the enemy was weak, but because the obstacle was singular. The war in Normandy hinged not on strategy, but on whether steel could be taught to cut earth instead of climb it. Curtis Culin's assessment did not originate from doctrine, staff studies, or formal engineering review. It came from watching tanks fail in the same way, repeatedly, under identical conditions. He observed that the Sherman itself was not inadequate. Its armor was sufficient against small arms fire. Its gun was effective. Its engine was reliable. The failure occurred at a single moment, when the tank attempted to climb. The hedgerow forced the vehicle upward. As the nose rose, the center of gravity shifted. Tracks lost traction. Forward motion slowed or stopped. The underside, thinly armored by design, became visible. At that moment, German infantry did not need maneuver or coordination. They waited. At close range, Panzerfaust struck exposed bellies and destroyed the tank with certainty. Culin identified the problem precisely. The tank was not meant to climb obstacles of this type. It needed to remain level. Its gun needed to stay aligned forward. The solution could not rely on speed, firepower, or courage. It had to change the physical interaction between steel and earth. He noticed something others ignored. Along the invasion beaches lay the remains of German defensive obstacles, steel beams driven into sand to rip open landing craft. These obstacles had been designed to resist force, not absorb it. They were sharp, angled, and structurally sound. Culin understood that their geometry was the inverse of the hedgerow problem. Where the hedgerow resisted by lifting, these beams could cut by penetrating. The insight was simple and specific. Instead of riding up the hedgerow, the tank should split it at ground level. The tank's mass would do the work if directed correctly. Culin did not request approval. He did not write a proposal. He gathered mechanics and scavenged steel. The first modifications were crude. Steel prongs were welded directly to the Sherman's front armor, reinforced to bear weight. The angle mattered. Too steep, and the tank would still climb. Too shallow, and the prongs would dig uselessly. Length mattered. Short prongs failed to penetrate. Long prongs risked structural damage. The work progressed through trial rather than theory. Tanks were driven into sample hedgerows under controlled conditions. Crews observed traction, balance, engine strain, and gun stability. Adjustments were made incrementally. Welds were strengthened. Prongs were reshaped. Failures were immediate and visible. Success was equally obvious. When the geometry was correct, the effect was decisive. The tank did not rise. The hedgerow broke apart at its base. Roots snapped. Earth parted. The Sherman pushed through level, gun forward, tracks gripping. Infantry could follow immediately through the breach without exposing themselves. Culin's credibility did not come from rank or persuasion. It came from demonstration. Officers watched tanks that had previously stalled now advance cleanly into enclosed fields. They saw that German infantry lost the critical moment when the tank was vulnerable. The ambush window closed. His preparation was limited to what mattered. There was no attempt to redesign the tank. No alteration to its engine, armor layout, or armament. The solution added nothing complex. It was additive, not transformative. Steel welded to steel. Force redirected, not increased. This restraint was critical. The modification could be applied rapidly, with existing tools, by frontline mechanics. It did not require factories or redesign approval. It could scale immediately if sanctioned. Culin's assessment also accounted for uniformity. The bocage was consistent. Hedgerows varied little in height and composition. A solution that worked once would work repeatedly. There was no need for specialized variants. One design would suffice across the sector. He did not claim to solve the campaign. He solved a single failure point. That focus mattered. The problem had paralyzed armor because it struck at the tank's most vulnerable moment. Remove that moment, and the system would function again. The preparation phase ended when the first tanks breached hedgerows under combat conditions and survived. That was the only metric that mattered. Losses dropped. Movement resumed. Infantry regained confidence in armored support. Culin did not articulate doctrine. He did not frame lessons. He prepared a tool that addressed a specific constraint at a specific time. The warning embedded in his work was implicit. Terrain could defeat armies as effectively as enemy fire. Doctrine could fail silently if it assumed the wrong environment. Solutions did not always originate where authority resided. By the time higher command noticed, the preparation was already complete. The evidence moved faster than the bureaucracy. The tanks were ready. The bocage was no longer absolute. What followed depended not on further insight, but on whether the system would accept an answer it had not ordered. The obstacle Culin's solution faced was not technical. It was institutional. Within the American command structure, authority flowed upward and modification flowed downward. Tanks were issued as finished systems. Altering them without approval violated both engineering protocol and command discipline. Field improvisation existed, but it was tolerated only when invisible. Once noticed, it demanded justification. Reports of welded steel prongs appearing on Sherman tanks reached battalion and regimental headquarters within days. The reaction was cautious rather than hostile. Officers did not dispute that tanks were failing in the bocage. They disputed whether unauthorized modification was an acceptable response. At higher levels, the problem was reframed. The bocage was described as a tactical inconvenience rather than an operational constraint. The assumption persisted that improved coordination, more artillery preparation, or increased infantry effort could compensate. Terrain was treated as something to be endured, not altered. This framing mattered because it preserved doctrinal comfort. If the problem was tactical, existing solutions sufficed. If it was mechanical, doctrine had failed. The institutional reflex was delay. Modifications required evaluation. Evaluation required reporting. Reporting required consensus. Each step consumed time the battlefield did not provide. There were additional pressures. The Allied command in Normandy was multinational and politically sensitive. Supreme Headquarters was balancing American momentum, British expectations, and the appearance of procedural control. Allowing junior personnel to visibly alter armored vehicles risked setting a precedent. If improvisation succeeded publicly, it implied that established planning had been inadequate. That implication carried weight. The Normandy landings were the most carefully planned operation of the war. Acknowledging that a fundamental environmental factor had been underestimated threatened confidence in the planning apparatus itself. Commanders were also wary of blame. If an unauthorized modification failed and crews were lost, responsibility would not rest with the welder or the idea's originator. It would rise upward. Caution, therefore, became a form of self-preservation. Logistics compounded the hesitation. The steel used came from captured German obstacles, not issued stock. Welding equipment was limited. Skilled mechanics were already overtasked repairing battle damage. Diverting resources without orders disrupted supply accounting and maintenance schedules. Every improvised tank was one less standardized tank on the books. There was also the matter of visibility. Tanks altered with steel horns were unmistakable. They could not be quietly ignored. Either they would be stopped or formally approved. At Corps and Army level, the discussion became procedural rather than practical. Questions were raised about structural stress on the Sherman's front plate, about potential interference with steering, about transport and embarkation issues. None of these concerns were irrelevant. None addressed the immediate cause of immobilization and loss. What broke the resistance was not argument, but repetition. Units using the modified tanks reported consistent results. Breaches were faster. Losses were lower. Infantry coordination improved immediately. German ambush patterns failed to produce expected results. These reports were difficult to dismiss because they did not rely on interpretation. They were comparative. Units operating side by side, in identical terrain, experienced radically different outcomes depending on whether the tanks had been modified. Once senior officers observed this directly, the calculus changed. The question was no longer whether the modification was authorized, but whether refusing it was defensible. General Omar Bradley's involvement marked the inflection point. Bradley did not champion innovation for its own sake. He accepted it because it worked and because the cost of delay was measurable in casualties. When he observed that modified tanks preserved infantry lives and restored forward movement, institutional resistance lost its justification. Authorization followed quickly once approval was unavoidable. Orders were issued standardizing the modification. Engineering units were instructed to replicate the design. Captured steel was formally requisitioned. What had been unauthorized became mandatory. The speed of the shift exposed the nature of the resistance. There had been no fundamental technical barrier, only procedural hesitation and risk aversion. Once command ownership was established, the system adapted without friction. The irony was unspoken. The solution required no new doctrine, no additional forces, no strategic revision. It required admitting that the environment had invalidated existing assumptions and that correction had originated outside the formal planning hierarchy. The overrule was not dramatic. No confrontation occurred. No individual was publicly corrected. The system simply absorbed the innovation and erased its origins. Credit became diffuse. Responsibility became collective. Curtis Culin did not become a decision-maker. His idea became an approved modification stripped of its improvised context. The machinery of command reasserted itself. What remained was the delay. Days lost while tanks burned. Infantry stalled while paperwork caught up to reality. The bocage had imposed a constraint. The institution had compounded it. The overrule, when it came, was not a rejection of Culin's work, but a delayed acceptance. The damage was already done. Momentum had been lost. Casualties had accumulated unnecessarily. The system functioned as designed. It protected hierarchy, process, and accountability. It did so at the expense of speed. Once the modification became official, resistance vanished. Production scaled. Units complied. The problem appeared solved by command decision rather than frontline necessity. That illusion mattered more than attribution. The campaign would move again. The record would show adaptation. What it would not show was how close institutional caution came to turning a solvable problem into prolonged attrition. The decision to accept the solution was made in command rooms. The cost of delaying it had already been paid in the fields between the hedgerows. The effects of the modification became visible almost immediately, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as the sudden absence of familiar failures. Tanks no longer stalled at the hedgerows. Crews no longer reported loss of traction at the point of contact. Infantry units no longer waited for armor that could not move. Where unmodified Shermans had previously paused, tilted upward, and died, the altered tanks moved forward level and continuous. The hedgerow ceased to be an event. It became an obstacle measured in seconds rather than minutes. This change altered the rhythm of combat across the American sector. Engagements that had stretched into prolonged exchanges collapsed quickly once tanks entered enclosed fields intact. German infantry positions, designed to exploit the moment of tank vulnerability, were exposed too early. Ambushes failed to trigger at the correct range. Panzerfaust teams were forced to react instead of wait. Losses declined in a way that required no interpretation. Tank crews survived breaches they would previously not have attempted. Infantry followed armor through created gaps rather than funneling through predictable openings. The pattern of casualties shifted from concentrated spikes to dispersed contact. The bocage had functioned as a force multiplier for the defender by imposing repetition. Every field recreated the same engagement. Every hedge forced the same climb. Once that repetition was broken, German units lost their only consistent advantage. Operational tempo increased unevenly at first. Units equipped with modified tanks advanced faster than adjacent formations still waiting for authorization. This disparity created localized breakthroughs. German forces attempting to hold contiguous lines found themselves outflanked within their own defensive system. Fields intended as compartments became corridors. Supply followed movement. As armored units advanced, road junctions previously unreachable were secured. Engineers cleared routes without constant interruption. Artillery forward observers regained visibility as armor pushed into new ground. Fire support became predictive again rather than reactive. The psychological effect was measurable without being spoken. American infantry regained confidence in armored support. Movement resumed without hesitation. Assaults were planned with expectation rather than contingency. German defenders, accustomed to controlling the pace of contact, found themselves displaced repeatedly without time to reset. The terrain did not change. The bocage remained dense, enclosed, and restrictive. What changed was its role. It no longer dictated outcomes. It ceased to function as a defensive system and reverted to being ground. This had cascading effects beyond immediate engagements. German commanders, already strained by limited reserves, were forced to respond to penetration rather than hold positions. Thinly manned units were bypassed instead of engaged. Command cohesion eroded as localized breakthroughs appeared without warning. The campaign's character shifted. Instead of clearing field by field through deliberate attrition, American forces began creating discontinuities. German resistance fragmented into isolated pockets rather than continuous lines. The bocage no longer allowed the defender to trade space for time. Time was taken from them. Casualty reports reflected the change. Losses did not disappear, but they aligned with expectations of mobile warfare rather than static clearance. Tanks were lost to mines and artillery rather than predictable close-range infantry ambush. Infantry casualties declined during advances because armor was present when needed. The modification also restored doctrinal coherence. Combined arms tactics functioned as intended. Armor suppressed. Infantry maneuvered. Artillery supported forward movement rather than preparatory destruction. Air support could be integrated once units broke out of enclosed spaces. This restoration mattered because it preserved momentum. The American logistical system was designed to support advance, not stagnation. Once movement resumed, supply efficiency improved. Fuel and ammunition flowed to units that could use them. Repair and recovery operations became feasible again. The German response was constrained. There was no rapid countermeasure to the steel prongs. Mines could slow movement, but they did not restore the hedgerow's defensive function. Artillery could engage advancing tanks, but visibility and reaction time were reduced. Infantry alone could no longer control engagement geometry. The bocage had been a passive defense requiring minimal resources. Its neutralization forced the Germans to expend manpower and munitions they did not possess in sufficient quantity. Operationally, this acceleration fed directly into the broader Normandy breakout. Once American units pushed beyond the densest hedgerow regions, maneuver space expanded rapidly. The transition from enclosed terrain to open movement occurred unevenly but decisively. The modification did not win Normandy. It removed the condition that was preventing Normandy from being won on schedule. It converted a stalled lodgment into a functioning front. Every subsequent advance traced back to this shift. Crossroads seized sooner. German units cut off earlier. Resistance encountered before it could organize. The cumulative effect was not dramatic in isolation, but decisive in aggregate. There was no single moment that marked victory over the bocage. There was only the disappearance of stagnation. Fields that had required hours were crossed in minutes. Advances measured in yards became advances measured in miles over the course of days. The campaign regained its intended shape. Pressure became continuous. German command decisions became reactive rather than deliberate. The initiative returned to the attacker. The consequence was not simply territorial gain. It was the prevention of prolonged attrition. Every day saved reduced casualties that would have accrued inevitably had the bocage remained dominant. Every field breached without loss preserved combat power for later operations. The hedgerows had been a natural fortress. Once breached mechanically, they offered no fallback advantage. They could not be rebuilt. They could not adapt. The Allied advance through Normandy resumed not because the enemy collapsed, but because the environment ceased to enforce paralysis. The battlefield stopped dictating outcomes independently of force. The consequence of the original delay remained. Time had been lost. Lives had been spent unnecessarily. German forces had used that time to withdraw, reorganize, and prepare subsequent defenses. The price of hesitation could not be recovered. But from the moment the modification was widely applied, the trajectory changed permanently. The bocage no longer defined the campaign. What followed was movement. Continuous, uneven, but irreversible. The steel prongs welded to Sherman tanks did not appear in victory parades. They were removed, discarded, forgotten. Their effect endured in the absence of something else, the silence of stalled engines at the base of hedgerows. That silence never returned. The post-war record clarified what had been obscured during the campaign. After-action reports, unit histories, and later staff studies treated the bocage problem as a solved technical issue rather than a command failure. The language was careful. The emphasis was on adaptation, not omission. Armored unit reports submitted in late 1944 and early 1945 consistently noted a marked reduction in tank losses once hedgerow breaching devices were introduced. The reports did not describe the devices as innovative. They described them as practical. The distinction mattered. Innovation implied prior error. Practicality implied inevitability. Memoirs written by senior commanders after the war acknowledged the bocage as an unanticipated constraint, but rarely addressed how narrowly its solution had been missed at higher levels. The narrative presented was orderly. The terrain was difficult. Adjustments were made. The advance continued. Curtis Culin appeared infrequently in official histories. When he did, his role was described as contributory rather than decisive. The modification itself was referenced more often than its origin. Credit diffused upward and outward, absorbed into institutional memory without emphasis on the conditions that delayed acceptance. This pattern was consistent with broader post-war framing. The Normandy campaign was presented as a continuous sequence of planned phases punctuated by expected friction. The bocage was categorized as friction. The Rhino tanks were categorized as adaptation. The delay between problem recognition and solution adoption was rarely examined. Later technical studies were more explicit. Engineering analyses confirmed that the Sherman's vulnerability during vertical obstacle ascent had been well understood in theory, but not anticipated in this specific terrain. The assumption had been that obstacles of this type would be limited or could be reduced by artillery. That assumption proved false. What the record made clear, without stating directly, was that the solution required no new knowledge. It required recognition that existing knowledge was being applied in the wrong context. The Sherman was not deficient. Doctrine was not flawed in isolation. The environment invalidated the interaction between the two. Veterans' accounts reinforced this conclusion. Tank crews described the first successful breaches with a consistent emphasis on relief rather than excitement. Infantry accounts noted the sudden reliability of armored support. The language was pragmatic. The bocage had been dangerous. Then it was not. No post-war analysis suggested that the campaign would have failed without the modification. That question was avoided. What was acknowledged was that the pace would have been slower and the cost higher. Those costs were measurable and documented. German post-war interrogations and studies provided an external confirmation. German officers repeatedly cited the bocage as their primary defensive asset in the American sector during June and early July 1944. They also noted the abrupt loss of its effectiveness. The timing matched the widespread appearance of modified tanks. From the German perspective, there had been no warning period. Positions that had held reliably suddenly did not. Units reported American armor appearing in places it had not before. Defensive plans based on compartmentalization collapsed without explanation. This external validation mattered because it removed interpretation from the equation. The enemy recognized the change as decisive at the tactical level. That recognition did not translate into an effective countermeasure. In institutional terms, the Rhino tank episode became an example cited quietly within engineering and armored branches as evidence of the value of field modification. It did not become a doctrine. It did not alter command structure. It did not change approval processes. The lesson, such as it was recorded, remained technical rather than organizational. The emphasis was on adaptability of equipment, not adaptability of authority. By the time official histories were compiled, the campaign had moved on to breakout, pursuit, and the collapse of German resistance in France. The bocage became a chapter rather than a hinge point. The modification became a footnote rather than a case study in decision latency. What survived in the record was outcome without process. The problem appeared. The solution appeared. The connection between the two was linear and sanitized. What did not survive was the cost of hesitation. The days when armor burned at hedgerows while a workable solution existed but lacked approval were not tallied. They were not framed as avoidable. The post-war record closed the case quietly. The bocage was overcome. Normandy succeeded. The war moved forward. The documentation did not ask whether the same outcome could have been achieved sooner or at lower cost had the system recognized the problem earlier. That question lay outside the scope of official analysis. The record settled on certainty rather than scrutiny. The hedgerows were breached. The advance resumed. The method became accepted fact. What remained unexamined was how narrowly the campaign avoided entrenching itself in unnecessary attrition, not because of enemy strength, but because of institutional delay in acknowledging a problem that had already been solved on the ground. The files closed with efficiency restored and momentum regained. The deeper implications were left unstated, preserved only in the quiet consistency of frontline testimony and the abrupt shift in casualty curves. The post-war record confirms effectiveness. It does not explain the delay. That omission is itself part of the historical conclusion. The case closes on a single fact. The American army in Normandy was not stopped by German strength. It was stopped by an unexamined assumption about terrain, and by the time required for the institution to admit that assumption was wrong. The bocage did not defeat American armor. The expectation that armor could function unchanged within it did. The Sherman tank was adequate. The troops were capable. The enemy was limited. The system failed at the point where doctrine met environment. Curtis Culin did not change strategy. He did not alter command relationships. He did not introduce a new weapon. He removed a single mechanical vulnerability that had turned terrain into a killing mechanism. Once that vulnerability was removed, the campaign resumed its intended course. The delay mattered. It cost time. It cost momentum. It cost lives that did not need to be lost. Those costs were not the result of enemy action. They were the product of institutional hesitation in recognizing a solved problem because it had been solved outside formal authority. Once accepted, the solution was implemented without difficulty. That sequence is the verdict. The obstacle was never complexity. It was permission. The Normandy campaign did not hinge on brilliance at the top or heroism at the front. It hinged on whether a rigid system could accept an answer it had not ordered. When it finally did, the battlefield changed immediately and permanently. The bocage ceased to function as a fortress the moment steel was taught to cut instead of climb. From that point forward, German defenses lost their only reliable advantage in the American sector. The advance resumed. Attrition gave way to movement. The outcome became inevitable. This was not a triumph of innovation culture or enlightened command. It was a correction made late, absorbed quietly, and recorded without emphasis. The record presents success. It does not dwell on the price of delay. The historical judgment is narrow and final. Normandy moved forward because a frontline solution was eventually allowed to become official. It moved later than it should have. It moved at a higher cost than necessary. The decision was never about whether the hedgerows could be breached. It was about how long the system would insist they could not. The case is closed. If this examination clarified how decisions shape outcomes long before battles do, consider subscribing. If you disagree with where responsibility truly lay, leave a comment.